in the Caribbean. Uh, so for our recap, we would have looked at two systems yesterday. What what were the two systems?
Sir, and community.
The two systems of production that we looked at.
And slash and burn.
I'm not hearing you. With
Encomienda
Encomienda
and
and
slash
slash
and
and
burn.
burn.
yes, encomienda and slash and burn. So those are the two systems that we would have looked at. Systems of production. Why are they systems of production? Why were they systems of production? Slash and burn and encomienda. What do we mean by systems of production? Go ahead, Jackson.
Sir, is it because it's a way in which foods and goods are provided for either domestic use or trade?
For domestic use and trade, correct. All right, so another system that we're going to look at is the plantation system. And the truth is that the syllabus has plantation system as one system of production and slavery as another. The truth is that slave labor was used on the plantation. So that is correct. However, not all places in which enslaved people were engaged in, for example, would have been a plantation. So, for example, you had enslaved people working in areas like the the marine life would have been one. The work on the sea. Enslaved blacks work on the sea also. They were enslaved to work on the sea. That was a system of slavery. In the system of slavery, but they didn't live on a plantation. For those in Belize and uh, that worked on the mahogany or the logwood trade, in which they go into the forest and they cut down wood. They never had plantations there, but slavery existed because they used slave labor. So that's one of the reasons why I believe no explanation was given, but I believe that's the reason why the syllabus would have separated plantation system from slavery, because not all slave labor was used uh, on the plantation. There are different other ways in which enslaved people was labor was used outside of the plantation setting. So before we go into that, I'm going to show you a small video on the plantation, and then we're going to have a discussion on the plantation. All right, ladies. So that's a small, a brief history of the plantation system, which the sugar plantation, which actually was started in Barbados. And so we're going to continue to look at the plantation system. One second. Okay. So once we're looking at the plantation started around the 1640s. And one of the first islands to have a plantation was Barbados. That's where the sugar revolution actually started in the Caribbean, not the first place in the world to produce sugar, but the first place in the Caribbean, not the first place in the Americas, because Brazil would have started sugar production way before the Caribbean. So one of the first places would have been Barbados, and then it would have transported to other parts of the Caribbean. Now, what Europeans did was that they acquired large plots of lands. And this is what, once they acquired the land, they used the land and they established great houses on the land, slave huts. But the main purpose of the land was to produce goods. For example, like sugar, coffee, cotton, cocoa. Those were some of the main, and to some extent, tobacco, right? They would have used. But the main one would have been sugar. One that we really know about was sugar. Now, the importance of the plantation. The plantation is very, very important. Uh, at that time to Europe. Very, very important to Europe. Uh, we know for sure that Europe was a very poor and underdeveloped continent. Not as what people want us to present that Europeans came to the Caribbean as uh, advanced people. They were way advanced than the Africans or the Asians, right? Or even the indigenous peoples, because there's nowhere in Europe that had those elaborate structures. Well, not true, but the if you look at the Taínos, the Mayan settlement or the settlement of the Aztecs, it is on par with some of the great buildings that we have seen in Europe, for example, in Greece or France or Rome. Very much similar. Well, not similar in design, but the structure is very much the same. So we know that the indigenous people were just as advanced as the Europeans. And but one thing that we know for sure was that at the time when the Europeans came to the Caribbean was very poor and underdeveloped. All right. And so the plantation system helped as a catalyst for development. In fact, Adam Smith, who is an economics, he said that the profits of a sugar plantation in any West India colony were much larger than other cultivation known either in Europe or America. So what Adam Smith was alluding to is that the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, they were very, very, very important to Europe. Very important. In fact, the profits that were made from the plantations in the Caribbean alone was way larger than what the profits that other cultivations made in Europe or in the United States. Well, they never had the United States then, but the North American colonies. In fact, Eric Williams, former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, one of the longest serving prime ministers in the Caribbean, he said that in the 1700s, Barbados was the most important single colony in the British Empire. Barbados was the most important single colony in the British Empire, worth much more than its total trade of Virginia and Maryland. And then he made another important point. Nevis was more important as a commercial trade base than New York, and Montserrat was ranked higher than Pennsylvania. So what we're seeing right here from what Eric Williams is alluding to, or what he has stated, is that in the 1700 Barbados as a colony was very important to the British Empire. Her trade was one of the largest trade out of all the colonies, including the North American colonies. The same thing with Nevis. Everybody know that Nevis is very small. Same thing with Montserrat, very small. But even Montserrat was ranked higher than Pennsylvania. And so what this is telling you is that the plantation was very, very important to European development. Now, the another point, ladies, is that Haiti, during around this time, Haiti was considered a leading colony also. And after the Haitian Revolution, Jamaica became a leading colony. The question I want to ask us, or one of the questions that we should look at, is the plantation system then and now. So we know for sure that the colonies produced raw materials, right? So that was how the plantation was organized, by the production of raw materials. So it was a system of production because it produced raw materials for export and also for local use. The colonies were not permitted to manufacture goods. And on the slave plantation, the sugar plantation, they used African labor because it was cheap. That's one of the reasons why African labor was used. Another feature of the plantation was that they had very rigid class structure. Very rigid, because you had the blacks at the base of the society, then you had the colored in uh, the the middle, and at the apex was the white. So we know it was very rigid. It was very difficult for the blacks, who were majority enslaved, to move up to the apex of the slave society, right? The or the society, I should say. Another feature of the plantation is that it had regulated housing. So the whites, they lived in the great houses, the slaves lived in the huts, and it's not all whites lived in the great houses. The rich, the very wealthy, the owners of plantations, those were the ones who lived in the great houses, and the other whites lived in other modest housing structure. Another feature of Caribbean slave plantation is the relationship with North America. So they relied on North America for food, some food items. For example, things like salt fish. the planters imported saltfish into the Caribbean. The the butter, rice, flour, all these different stuff they would have imported. Peas, a strong reliance on North America for food. Not only that, the clothing that the enslaved people actually wore actually came from North America. The cloth, all these different things came from North America. Another thing with the plantation is that it operated in a space where there was actually restricted trade. So they could not trade between each other. The French had an exclusive policy that said that you only trade with French colonies. Caribbean colonies could not trade with each other. They You need permission for trade. They never had free trade. It was restricted. The British also had their policy also, the British Navigational Act that says you should trade only with British. They they only trade with Britain. So for example, with the British Navigational Act, if I am a planter in Jamaica, I need to send some goods to Barbados or St. Vincent. It was not permitted. I had to send those goods to Britain and then Britain retransport it. Or I need permission from Britain in order to trade with another Caribbean colony, even if it was a British colony, right? Spanish also had their restrictions also. So we know for sure that these were some of the features of the Caribbean. The African religion on the plantation, every our African culture on the plantation was banned. They were not permitted to beat things, to use the drum. They were not permitted to use their horn. Well, the what they call it again? The abeng, that cow horn. They couldn't use it. The names were changed. So what we have is that the African culture was banned, and any form of Christianity education that was given to the enslaved, it was a Christian-based education. So they use the Bible in which they use and they teach them the Bible. Now, so we know for sure that these were some of the features of Caribbean slave plantation. The point I'm also going to make is that the plantation system is also reflected today in today's society. Very much the same. You might have some differences, but quite a lot of scholars, for example, people like Norman Gervan, uh, George Beckford, Norman Gervan, can't remember the name of another scholar, they all would have argued that the plantation, the system of the plantation is still in today's society. In today's society. Anyone disagree or agrees with that statement?
I agree, sir.
You agree? Tell me why you agree.
Sir, because a lot of features of the what constituted the plantation society still exist in the Caribbean today. So, for example, Caribbean countries still have ties to the metropole. For
Yeah.
example, like we still recognize the queen in Jamaica. We still recognize the queen as the head of state. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in Barbados they're like working on like removing the queen of head of state. Well, it's more progressive now, but there are still features of the plantation society that still exist in contemporary Caribbean, like the fact that we still produce raw material and export it to like European nations. And I think
Mhm.
George Beckford, the sociologist, talks a lot about it in his plantation system theory.
Yes, and you are correct. And so, anyone else, any other comment on this? All right.
Sir,
So we know, go ahead.
I agree as well. In terms of the class system, it's not as rigid as it was back then. It's more subtle, especially in countries like Trinidad, where you have the Indians and the blacks.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's good. Very good point about the class system that still remains in the Caribbean. Uh, any other point?
Sir, two other people who speak about the plantation society were Best and Levitt.
Yes. Best. Best was the one I was trying to remember. Lloyd Best. Uh, the so we know for sure that scholars have all looked at it, right? The so no so for example, no, let us look at some of the systems that we have today. So for example, as mentioned earlier, colonies were only allowed to produce raw material. In today's Caribbean countries, we do produce manufactured goods, but guess what? Most of the time, Caribbean countries, just the sole function of Caribbean countries is to produce raw material. One perfect example, let us look at our own island, Jamaica. Which raw material we provide the developed countries with?
Bauxite.
Bauxite, right? We are not manufacturing the bauxite into things like aluminum and all of these different products, right? We are still sending the raw bauxite to to North to North America or to Europe. So we are still largely producing raw materials, even when it comes to fruits and vegetables. We send most of the time when we are sending food items abroad, we send the fruits and the vegetables as raw material. The same tin, uh, that little stuff uh, that little tin mixed fruits that we have at the supermarket, when especially when you're doing a baking and all of these different stuff, you use the mixed fruits in it. All of those mixed fruits are uh, that we use. The we send the mango from here to North America. They do their things to it and send it back to us in the form of a tin, right? So things like that. And Caribbean countries are largely import driven. We import more than we export. Another thing is that during the plantation, uh, you were not permitted to the colonies were not permitted to manufacture goods. Manufacturing goods was a no-no. However, in the plantation, in today's society, while we don't have any restriction when it comes to manufacturing goods, it is Caribbean countries are manufacturing way less goods than it should be manufacturing, right? For example, the only country right now in the Caribbean that is really doing good when it comes to manufacturing is Trinidad and Tobago. That is the only country. Jamaica, we are very, very import driven. Even with Trinidad and Tobago, that has a strong export trade where they send out manufactured goods out of the region. The thing is that we all they also have a very high import bill in Trinidad. Another thing when it comes to manufacturing that the plantation still is resembles today is also when it comes to the not only the when we talk with raw material, back then we used to be the Caribbean used to be the one to produce the raw material and send it to the European nations, right? Today we are importing raw materials. And then, so even the goods that we so-called manufactured are imported materials. The peanuts that you eat, the sunshine peanut, the holiday snacks, and all of these, that is Caribbean snack. All of those things are imported. The cheese, even chicken back, all the chicken back that you see and that people selling is imported. It comes on the ship to the Caribbean and we purchase the chicken back. Everything is imported. Very, very uh, strong import trade, even when it comes to milk, the Lasco. So Lasco is a Caribbean brand, a Jamaican brand. But guess what? The powder that is the powder that they package actually comes the from Asia, it comes from abroad, and it comes into the Caribbean. The orange juice that most of us drink is also, well, not all of it, but if you buy true juice is very much Jamaican, right? But there are other brands that we use that they just buy the syrup, they the orange syrup, and they put it in the box and they sell it as orange juice. Perfect example, Burger King. You go to Burger King and ask for a top up with orange juice. And when you look, they give you it tastes like orange, but it's not orange juice, it's syrup they give to you. You can go to Price Mart and buy the syrup. That syrup what they call squash or something like that. And you buy it and mix it with water and you realize that it's the very same thing that you're drinking. That you buy at Burger King, the orange that tastes horrible. And so one of the things that we know for sure is that the Caribbean societies, uh, we still provide quite a lot of raw materials for the developed countries, and we have low levels of manufacturing. Another feature of Caribbean society is the class structure. It might not be as rigid as slavery, but it is very, 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 very rigid. Well, I shouldn't say rigid, but because rigid means you can't move up or down, but it is still present, it remains. If you look at our society today, and we don't even have to go to Trinidad because one of the most classist country in the entire world where inequality is at its peak is Jamaica. Even when Barack Obama was president, he mentioned Jamaica about the classism in Jamaica, the inequality in Jamaica. Jamaica is a very unequal society. The rich is very, very rich and the poor is very, very poor. The middle class is suffering. And so when it comes to class structure in the Caribbean, it's very much the same as back then, still reflected. You have the uptown, the mere fact that you have the concept of uptown versus downtown show that there is not only a geographic space when you use the word uptown and downtown. It is not only pointing to, oh, I'm going downtown Kingston, I'm going to uptown Kingston. No. When you actually mention those concepts of uptown and downtown, you are reinforcing the class structure that exists in the society. I'm not a perfect example of the class structure that exists in the society. Majority of students from certain schools are online doing learning, while some schools and in some areas in the same country are in the same space. For example, in Kingston. So, for example, you have schools like maybe Campion, St. Andrew, Immaculate, all of these different schools, Jamaica College, that's reporting that 90% of their students are, are turning out for online schools. But there are some schools that are in not very far from uh, Jamaica College or Campion, Papine High, which is reporting 30–40% of the students. It's just a 10 minutes drive. And they are reporting way less students attending because even though they are in the same geographic space, there is still a class divide of the students that attend a certain schools. Not saying that poor people's children don't attend the other schools, but they get much more help when they attend certain schools. So there's class divide in the society. Another thing is cheap labor. Back then, the plantation provided cheap labor. In today's society, cheap labor is still, the Caribbean is seen as a place that provides cheap labor for the developed countries. So if you check most of the our people that migrate, they go and uh, work as domestics for very cheap. Even when they go and work as teachers and nurses and police officers, they are not paid the same rate as the whites in those societies. Next, regulated housing. Uh, Regulated housing was also a feature of Caribbean societies. Today, we still have regulated houses. Majority of Blacks live in the slums or informal communities are what we call ghetto. And I'm speaking in the case of Jamaica, but this is also the same in North America, it's the same in Brazil or places in Central America, where majority of the persons who the group that live in the slums or the informal communities are blacks. Blacks are still at the base. You still have a look, you still have uh, quite a lot of what we call it now. We still have blacks who live in very formal communities, but the fact remains that you would never see a white man living in the ghetto. You'll never see it. In the Caribbean, you'll never see a white man living in the ghetto or white families that are poor and living in the ghetto struggling. No, you don't see that. It is just majority of those people are the blacks, and it's regulated because it's exclude the people from these communities. How these societies were, communities were formed, informal settlement, the government would have neglected them. The government would have neglected them, and so because of the neglect of these societies or the people, they go and capture land and they live. Another thing when it comes to the plantation then and now that is very much reflected in today's society is a strong reliance on North America for goods. Our taste bud is very North American. So you go to Price Mart and you're going to see true juice versus Florida orange juice. And most of you are going to take the Florida orange juice. instead of the true Jews. That's just the fact. Instead of you have your local food for breakfast, you go and support the the man on the road. If you're in Barbados or St. Vincent or Grenada, you go and get something, for example, like a, a fish cake, what we call splitters here, and you eat it with eggs and whatever. The truth is that you're going to Burger King for breakfast. Very North American. Still rely on North America for all the goods. The next thing is that even though we can trade between Caribbean countries today, international trade is still controlled by the developed countries, the World Trade Organization. So we really can't trade. We can't trade as freely as we want, but there are some level of control that is outside of our hands as Caribbean people. Next, suppression of the language. Our language was suppressed, our skin color was suppressed, our religion was suppressed as Africans, right? Our people of African descent. The if you look at the skin color today, there's a phenomenon that is called bleaching, where people bleach them skin. Why? Because that comes from years of psychological enslavement, that your skin was not, your color of your skin was not good. You have to be white. So when people see this level of self-hate that happens in the society, it is because of slavery why people still hate the color of their skin. When we use terms like the black cat is the worst, is for bad luck. When in Africa, the black cat actually means that something good is going to happen. The black spot, you're too pretty for a black girl, or you're all of these different stuff. Your language, using African words such as gal and nyam, is seen as uncouth. When people actually speak in their their the local dialect that has a mixture of the African or the Indian mixed with the English, you laugh at them. It's because of the legacies of the plantation that still remains today. Our school system is very Christian based. You go to school, you have a devotion, you pray. It teach you to, if you find most of the schools, you'll find that they have the pledges and all of these different stuff. The school motto and all of that is in religious uh, uh, things. It is a form of suppression. Another example is the hair. Black hair is seen as bad hair. The example of the young lady, the family from Portmore the other day in Jamaica, that the child was initially told she could not come to the school because she had locks. How is it in 21st century 2020, the Supreme Court in Jamaica ruling that the school was correct in telling the student or telling the parents that a 7-year-old could not go to school because the child chose to wear her natural hair? How is that possible? Why is it that it still continues? That everything African and everything black is seen as negative. something is seriously wrong with our society. And even our court system, look at even in parliament that they wear the white wig. Legacy of the plantation. So you wear a white wig, but you're telling a child that they should not lock their hair because the white hair, the black hair, African hair is will form Jundra or something to that effect. Foolishness, but that is part of our society. And we just have to accept it. My point here is to show you, or from what the syllabus asks us to do, the syllabus asks us to look at what was the plantation then, how is the plantation reflected in today's society. And without a doubt, we know for sure that whether it is social, religious, or economic, the plantation system is still alive and well in the Caribbean. And because of it is still alive and well in the Caribbean, and we have seen the various aspects of it, we know that it was an oppressive system. Because if we look, European controls the African legally, physically, psychologically, culturally, right? And over 15 million Africans were imported to the Americas. It was oppressive. Many persons would have died on the plantation. And so we know for sure that this system of production, the plantation that was primarily used for sugar production, it was important to Britain, it was important to other European countries. The system that existed then, though changed to some extent, it still exists in some form in the Caribbean today. Any comments, ladies? Any comments? All right. So, ladies, on Monday, we are going to move on to slave society, where we're going to look at the system of slavery. All right, ladies, enjoy the rest of the afternoon, the morning, sorry.
Same to you, sir. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
sir.
sir.
Thank you.
Bye bye.